It didn't start with a crime. It didn't start with a scandal. It started with silence. The kind of silence that only exists when something is being hidden. For years, people talked. They whispered. They pointed at things that didn't make sense. Private jets flying to the same places. Powerful names appearing in the same circles. Strange patterns that no one could fully explain. But every time someone got close to the truth, the story disappeared. Files were sealed, names were removed, voices were ignored, and slowly, people stopped asking questions. Because questioning power comes with consequences. So the world moved on, or at least, that's what it looked like. Until 2026, because that's when everything changed. Not rumors, not theories, documents, thousands of them, unfiltered, unedited, untouched. For the first time, the details weren't hidden anymore. Dates, locations, connections, all laid out in a way no one had ever seen before. And the deeper people looked, the more disturbing it became. Because this wasn't just about one man. It was never just about one man. It was about a network, a system, something far bigger, operating quietly in the background. The kind of system you're not supposed to see. And when the files finally opened, some people spoke, some people panicked, and some people went completely silent. Because the truth wasn't just shocking, it was dangerous. Dangerous enough to change how you see power. Dangerous enough to make you question everything. So now the question is, what exactly was hidden inside those files that made the most powerful people in the world say nothing at all? What you just heard, that's only the surface. Because to understand how deep this goes, we need to go back to where all of this really began. What you just heard is only the surface of something far deeper, because to truly understand how extensive this story is, we need to step back to a time before the documents were released, before global headlines began dominating public attention, and before most people even realized that anything unusual was happening behind closed doors, in environments that were carefully controlled, deliberately structured, and designed in a way that limited visibility, restricted access, and ensured that only a small number of individuals could truly understand what was happening within those spaces. For years, Jeffrey Epstein existed within a world that was defined not only by wealth, but by proximity to influence, by access to individuals who held power across different sectors, and by the ability to move between private environments without attracting the kind of attention that would normally raise suspicion. And because everything appeared ordinary on the surface, there was little reason for the public to question what might exist beneath that surface, or to consider that what appeared normal might actually be carefully constructed to remain unquestioned. The story itself did not begin as a single clear narrative that people could easily follow or understand, but rather as scattered fragments of information, small details that appeared unrelated at first glance, such as a name mentioned briefly in a report, a record of travel that did not immediately seem unusual, or a location that appeared once and then quietly disappeared from attention, leaving no obvious reason for further investigation. And because these details existed separately, they were easy to dismiss, easy to overlook, and easy to ignore. Individually, each of these fragments felt insignificant, and because they lacked context, they did not appear to be connected in any meaningful way, which is exactly why they remained unnoticed for such a long period of time. But over time, those fragments began to repeat across different timelines, different documents, and different situations, and repetition is where patterns begin to form, especially when similar details appear again and again without a clear explanation. As those patterns slowly started to emerge, people began to notice that certain elements kept appearing repeatedly, not just once, but across multiple sources, multiple timelines, and multiple contexts. And when the same details appear consistently without an obvious reason, they begin to challenge the idea that everything is simply coincidence, because coincidence becomes less convincing when repetition becomes predictable. At first, it was still possible to explain these patterns away because coincidence offers a simple and comfortable explanation that allows people to avoid asking deeper or more uncomfortable questions. But when those same patterns continued to appear with consistency, alignment, and repetition over time, the idea of coincidence began to lose its credibility and curiosity began to take its place, pushing people to look closer, to analyze more deeply, and to question assumptions that had previously gone unchallenged. That curiosity led to deeper observation, and deeper observation led to comparison, because once people begin to notice patterns, they start looking for more of them, comparing details across different records, identifying similarities, and trying to understand how different pieces of information might connect. And in doing so, they begin to see a broader picture that was not visible when those pieces were viewed individually. Flight logs became one of the most discussed elements in this process, not because they provided clear answers, but because they showed movement, repeated travel, and connections between individuals. And while being listed in a record does not explain intent, it does establish presence. And presence, when repeated across multiple situations, raises questions that are difficult to ignore, especially when those movements align with other patterns that are beginning to emerge. At the same time, testimonies that had once been overlooked or dismissed began to receive more attention, and when those accounts were included within official documentation, they gained a level of credibility that made them harder to dismiss, particularly when they aligned with patterns that had already been observed independently, creating a situation where multiple sources pointed towards similar conclusions, even if those conclusions were not yet fully defined or understood. However, even with this growing body of information, the overall picture remained incomplete, largely due to the presence of redacted sections within many of the documents, where names were removed, details were obscured, and context was missing, creating gaps in understanding that made it difficult to draw clear conclusions, and those gaps themselves became a source of curiosity, because when information is hidden, it raises questions about why it was hidden and what might exist within those missing sections. As more people began analyzing both the visible information and the missing pieces, they started to see that the situation was not random, but structured, not chaotic, but consistent. And when something shows consistency over time, it suggests that there is an underlying system maintaining that consistency. Because without structure, repetition of that nature would be difficult to sustain over long periods. Systems, by their nature, are complex because they involve multiple layers, multiple participants, and varying levels of awareness. And in systems like this, not everyone involved necessarily understands the full picture, which makes it even more difficult to fully expose or explain, because no single individual holds all the information, and that fragmentation allows the system to continue operating without being fully understood. When information is distributed unevenly, accountability becomes more complicated because no single person can fully explain how everything works, and that lack of complete understanding creates a form of protection within the system itself, allowing it to persist even under scrutiny, because each piece of information on its own does not reveal the whole picture, but together those pieces begin to suggest something much larger. As analysis continued, people began comparing documents side by side, looking for overlaps, inconsistencies, and repeated patterns that suggested connections between different elements. And while none of these connections provided definitive answers on their own, together they created a pattern that was difficult to ignore, reinforcing the idea that the situation involved more than isolated events. These patterns pointed towards something larger than individual actions, suggesting the existence of a network, a system that extended beyond one person and involved multiple layers of interaction. coordination, and continuity over time. And systems like that do not exist without structure, because structure is what allows them to function, to adapt, and to continue. This realization shifted the focus away from individual details and toward understanding the system as a whole. Because once the focus moves from isolated events to interconnected systems, the questions begin to change. And instead of asking what happened, people begin asking how it happened, how it continued, and what factors allowed it to exist for so long without being fully understood. One of the key factors in understanding this system is influence, particularly the kind of influence that operates quietly, without drawing attention, shaping outcomes behind the scenes rather than through visible authority. And because it is not obvious, it is much harder to identify and even more difficult to challenge, especially when it operates within structures that appear normal on the surface. Influence can exist within institutions, within networks, and within relationships, shaping decisions and outcomes in ways that are not always visible. And this subtle form of influence is what makes systems like this difficult to fully understand, because it does not operate in a way that can be easily observed or measured. As awareness of these dynamics grew, it became clear that the situation was not just about one individual, but about how networks function, how connections form, and how influence can shape outcomes in ways that are not immediately visible. And that broader understanding began to change how people viewed the entire situation. As more people became aware of these patterns, they began to question what they once accepted without hesitation. And once those questions begin, they do not easily stop, because questioning leads to investigation. Investigation leads to more questions, and those questions continue to expand the scope of what is being examined. And that is what keeps the story alive, not the answers, but the questions. Because as long as there are unanswered questions, there will always be continued interest, continued curiosity, and continued attempts to understand what lies beneath the surface. Because once people begin to see patterns, once they begin to question assumptions, and once they begin to understand that what is visible is not always the full picture, their perspective begins to change. And that change in perspective affects how everything else is interpreted. And once that shift happens, it becomes difficult to go back, because awareness changes how information is processed, how events are understood, and how reality itself is perceived, making it impossible to return to a time when those patterns were not visible. And once that happens, there is no going back.